Thanks to Simon and for the team at the IASPM for having me and for the opportunity to be part of this really exciting online version of the conference this year. As a guitarist and a researcher who straddles many spheres of music, the way in which the guitar community interacts as a community has always interested me. Most particularly, in this case, is the way in which different factions of the guitar world often have very differing views to technology, timbre, and the multitude of ways in which we experience the guitar, both performatively and as listeners. The following research is part of an ongoing study into a microcosm of the guitar multiverse, the study of the role of distortion in jazz guitar. While labels such as jazz guitar carry with them a degree of loaded meanings, understanding, preconception, and in some cases even prejudices, it is important that there is some sense of delineation used here to create a foundation to build from, which we will do. Distortion too as a term can be every bit as pejorative in nature when placed within the jazz community. While often met with disdain from traditionalists, distortion is now one of the many devices which have enabled traditional notions of performative or compositional devices to be expanded, extended, enhancing the creative possibilities for the jazz guitar improviser or composer. This is of course not to say that the discussion of distortion and the electric guitar is a new field. It isn't. However, this usually takes place in the context of rock music, as will be seen. This short study will give an overview of the developing research, which should be published later in the year, exploring the changing landscape of jazz guitar as viewed through the prism of distortion, production, and wider notions of the emergence of a postmodern jazz guitarscape. I do hope you enjoy. Thank you.
To begin with, I will quickly address some of the many issues that surround this research, beginning with definitions. While a short presentation of this length can do no justice to the multiple perspectives that identify distortion, for example the differences in definition by those concerned with the science of signal generation and manipulation, and those more concerned with the playing of their instrument, some initial perspectives can help unmire what Scotto calls a complex phenomenon that resists simple categorization. Ciro Scotto's study gives an appropriate foundation. He says, distortion is any change between the input and the output of a signal in a system. Post describes this simply as the departure from some presumed ideal linearity. In the vernacular of the guitar community, many words are used to describe this. Overdrive, drive, and distortion are often used interchangeably. There is, however, no academic or professional consensus on the difference. Other terms are used regularly to describe the sound in analogous terms. Drive, crunch, dirt, boost, fuzz, although this is mostly differentiated. On a continuum of differences, the terms overdrive, distortion, and fuzz represent the continuum of saturation from low to high. What is interesting in particular about distortion and its use with the electric guitar is the overtones that it produces, a side effect of the compression of a signal, and by extension the rich coloration of harmony this produces. Distortion does not need to be considered pejorative, of course, as Post states, distortion and purity are not antithetical. There are of course many other definitions worth mentioning here. One that stands out is that of Vertala. If giving a clear and simple definition of distortion was problematic, providing a working definition of jazz in this setting is nothing short of an enigma. While of course it would be useful to unpick the various definitions and rich scholarly work that informs said definitions, there is simply not enough time to do so. The following section, which discusses the contemporary jazz guitarscape, will provide useful boundaries, definitions, and ways of aligning the context of this research. It is worth briefly mentioning, however, at the onset, that the term jazz and jazz guitar is used here with more of an associative approach. More objectively, the examples, references, and case studies of guitarists have been considered by their range of associations, including, but not limited to those that have, worked with band leaders widely accepted in the jazz canon, those that have notable use of musical elements associated with jazz, those that use processes integral to the craft, for example improvisation or ensemble interaction, those that interact with the canon of repertoire, those that have been referred to secondarily as part of the jazz canon, and of course those that are connected in some way to the ever-changing definitions of jazz. There is currently no research that deals specifically with distortion in jazz guitar. However, there are a range of fields which intersect, forming a Venn around jazz guitar distortion. In the interest of time and succinctness, more information on the research, which is built around timbre, properties of distortion, jazz guitar studies, organology, and the guitar's relationship with distortion, have been put in the video appendix, which appears directly after the presentation. My intention here as a popular musicologist sitting on the fringes of all of these subjects is to create a platform for jazz guitar and distortion, although more broadly speaking, all timbral elements, in order to spark discourse. The imagery conjured by the phrase jazz guitar is tied closely to the traditional and homogeneous styles of music that encapsulated jazz 60 years before. It is in fact a much broader picture in modern times, however. Jazz guitar is no longer defined by the archtop playing acolytes of Wes Montgomery. In fact, many contemporary jazz guitarists are known for their complete abandonment of such imagery in the pursuit of other means of expressive qualities not available in the traditional model. On one end, traditional artists such as Jonathan Kreisberg, Kurt Rosenwinkel and Gilad Hexelman are testament to the continued development of perhaps what we might call purist forms of jazz guitar. On another, however, Bill Frisell, John Schofield, Wayne Krantz, Mark Ribot and even Mark Lettieri are just a few that have remained in the pantheon of jazz guitarists while eschewing the tradition almost entirely. It would be remiss not to include a whistle-stop tour of those guitarists who use distortion both directly and indirectly, many of whom have realigned the trajectory of the development of jazz guitar. While the focus of this paper lies in the ways electronic amplification, stomp boxes and other effects create and add distortion, extending the guitar itself, it is important to note that the guitar is where the signal begins. In the case of early jazz guitar, the differing levels of attack of the instrument become in many ways analogous to the differing levels of distortion afforded to us by modern technology. Early guitar recordings, such as those by Lonnie Johnson and Eddie Lang, have an almost distorted quality to them. The former, most definitely so. Blue Ghost Blues by Lonnie Johnson is a clear example of this. Johnson of course went on to use an electric guitar, and as a pioneer, crossing over from blues to a more jazz-informed approach, produced many recordings with a guitar timbre that was distinctly ahead of its time. See for example, He's a Jelly Roll Baker. Furthermore, the purposefully harsh attack, symptomatic of the right-hand technique used by Django Reinhardt in the earlier quintet recordings, give frequent moments where the attack is so aggressive the instrument itself gives a distorted quality. It is perhaps interesting that both Johnson and Reinhardt went on to record with electric guitars, often demonstrating keen attention to the timbral qualities of their instrument and amplifier to help accentuate certain passages. Reinhardt's 1947 recording of the gypsy jazz classic Minor Swing, for instance, has distinctly different timbres, attack and sound on each subsequent chorus he plays, at times the amplifier on the cusp of breaking up entirely. 1953's Blues for Ike is perhaps the most clearly heard distortion sound from Django, and is a world removed from the quintet recordings. Perhaps then even Reinhardt here was aware of the value of timbral control, and indeed distortion's role in creative improvisation. As distortion started to become more prevalent in rock and pop arenas around the turn of the 1950s, many guitarists in the rock arena were experimenting with ways of creating more distortion. There are many famous mythologies surrounding the creation of these new sounds. You'll have heard some of them before, such as Jackie Brenston's Rocket 88's sound being attributed to a broken amp distortion, Link Wray poking holes in his speaker cone with a pencil, and of course the Kinks guitarist Dave Davis using razor blades to slash holes in his speaker cones. The same cannot be said for jazz guitar. In the late 30s and 40s, the beginnings of what we might now call the traditional sound were born. Led by an ideology of clarity, championed perhaps by the likes of Les Paul, the timbral aim was to create a warm, smooth and round sound which was less bright, aggressive and jagged than the guitar's previous associations. While this was in part down to the playing style of individuals, the instruments, pickup technology and amplification had developed significantly enough that achieving a much clearer signal and tone was possible. The historical pantheon of jazz guitarists is perhaps at its most dense during this period, due to the clear homogenization in the style. Perhaps spearheaded by Charlie Christian, Wes Montgomery, Tal Farlow, Joe Pass, Herb Ellis, Jim Hall, Kenny Burrell, Jimmy Rainey and Barney Kessel are among many who steered the guitar from the associative trappings of the roots blues sound towards a more serious occupation in the late swing, bop and cool eras. During this time, we see less in the way of timbrel exploration than perhaps in earlier jazz styles. This was purposeful. Jazz was at this point no longer simply a dance hall phenomenon. It was a serious music for serious musicians. Feasibly, the stigma that traditionalists have for distortion comes from this era, where distortion was being popularised in what was then diametrically opposed to jazz, rock music. For the most part, the sound that began in the late 30s encapsulated jazz guitar until the 60s. While Miles Davis is conceivably the embodiment of change and reinvention in jazz, the effect he had on the jazz guitar community has never been fully explored. Over the course of Miles's output from the mid-60s until his death, he employed a range of electric guitarists, each with a unique voice. Other than George Benson's few feature tracks on Miles in the Sky, Miles's main guitarists have included John McLaughlin, Mike Stern and John Schofield. Others who have collaborated with Miles include Larry Carrell, Robin Ford, Mike Landau, Bjorn Rupe, Jean-Paul Pirelli and Pete Cozy. All of these guitarists are renowned for their use of distortion and effects. During this time, the harmonic language of players changed too. While there were still allusions to former styles, the trappings of bop were cast off and the visceral agency and power of rock adopted. Timbre here becomes fully central to the understanding of the music, and with that a much wider range of distortion. At this point, distortion is no longer simply a colour, it is an extension of the instrument itself, with the focus of the improvisations moving towards the creation of detailed and varying fields of sound. Davis's effect on the guitar runs deeper than this, of course, as we will see by looking at the secondary connections created by his other sidemen who make up the who's who of the 70s and 80s fusion movement, and by extension, their guitarists. Distortion and effects became a mainstay of many jazz guitarists, but as with many things, the pendulum swings back towards the centre ground eventually. In this respect, the space that occupies the 80s to the early 2000s is a rich area of jazz guitar, and the place where many historical accounts simply stop. During this period, the boundaries surrounding the definitions of jazz continue to blur, which in turn sparks a number of slipstreams of development, some more rooted in the sound popularised in the 60s and 70s, and some more adherent to the traditional. While an enormous task to unpick here, it is important to survey those whose use of distortion is integral to their sound. At this point, guitarists were becoming more scientific with their use of sound. Pat Metheny continually redesigned his sound, creating incredibly complex setups and unique sound worlds. Bill Frisell is perhaps one of the most well-known explorers of contemporary jazz guitar timbre. Frisell uses distortion in a range of ways, and perhaps most acutely straddles all of the rationales presented in the following section. Alan Holdsworth is another guitarist, for example, that spent a lifetime using distortion to make his guitar sound more horn-like, pursuing the sound of an instrument he coveted. A curious scene started to emerge around the mid-90s in New York. At the head of this was guitarist Kurt Rosenwinkel. The sound that Kurt produced was entirely unique and finely straddled the traditional and the modern. His sound comprised of an archtop electric guitar, effects pedals, and most importantly his distortion, the Proco Rat pedal. It inspired a range of other guitarists who adopted a very similar sound and setup more generally. What Rosenwinkel managed to do here was recreate the tight homogeneity of earlier eras of traditional jazz, and in doing so, an identifiable community sound. This is a sound that is at once traditional and connected to the primitive acoustic roots of jazz guitar, but also modern, with a timbre as equally considered as the harmony and rhythmic choices therein. In some ways, the contemporary New York scene represents a unification of traditionalism and modernism. Kurt's use of distortion can be heard most effectively on the live album The Remedy. The boundaries surrounding jazz guitar have all but dissipated in the 21st century. While there are still strands of hardcore innovators and traditionalists, sometimes at odds, there are many who sit comfortably within the jazz domain who use distortion expressively. Some of these include Wayne Krantz, Oz Noy, Nir Felder, Mark Ribot, Nels Klein, Ben Yunson, and Miles Okazaki, just to name a few. Whilst this research is still expanding, considering the intersecting research domains, primary research and historical account, there are a number of emerging rationales for jazz guitarists' use of distortion. At its simplest, amplified distortion affords the guitar more sustain, giving the player more command of the length of their notes. In doing so, it makes the touch required easier, which can be a positive or a negative. As the marketplace grows and more distortion equipment becomes available, each with subtle nuances and finely tuned characteristics, it becomes easier to curate a distinctive sound. As a particular player or a set of players begin to gather around a specific sound, that sound becomes attached to the domain of which they are part. Guitarists may wish to recreate the sounds of those they wish to emulate, in part to authenticate themselves within the same domain. The market structure of instrument, amplifier and effects pedal sales is testament to this, growing year on year. Just as a guitarist can learn new scales to improvise with, they can curate new timbres to do the same. Distortion is one of many categories of timbre manipulation and can be used to create dynamic contours of timbre, which over the course of a singular piece of music, an album, or the entire output of a jazz guitarist, gives a narrative of sound every bit as important as the notes themselves. Considering the control of timbre in this way realigns its position within the hierarchy of jazz practice. Choice of, use and control of distortion becomes not simply a sound coloration, but an improvisatory device in and of itself. Timbral vocabulary or vernacular is analogous in this sense to harmonic, rhythmic and melodic vocabulary, and in some domains every bit, if not more, important. The developments in portable audio manipulation devices, or simply stomp boxes, allow a guitarist to have the full spectrum of analog and digital sound production at the tap of a foot. As La Dioja writes, the electric guitar appears as a solidly anchored, augmented and augmentable instrument. Its hybrid instrumental praxis is widely integrated by guitarists who routinely work with the acoustic, electric and digital parts of their instrument. Foulon discusses modes of guitar playing in his study, but only considers the physical input, for example, hands-on instrument. Perhaps distortion, or indeed other effects, become part of the instrument, and in some ways we play the distortion every bit as much as we play the guitar. Instrument augmentation can be defined as a process in which a given instrument's sonic possibilities are expanded by technological means, without jeopardizing the initial instrument's playing, its sonic expressive possibilities as well as its ergonomics. As Miranda and Wanderley write, to summarize, jazz guitarists' use of distortion, and any other effects such as chorus, delay, ring modulation, and harmonizers to name but a few, extend their instrument by means of modular augmentation. They do not think of these as other, but instead as integral to the desired sound production. The guitar, in the conventional sense, simply becomes a controller for these modular elements. The hierarchy in jazz has typically been led by brass players. The guitar, of course, was not a solo instrument initially, and subsequent eras and movements tend to have been spearheaded by brass players. As such, the tone produced by saxophonists and trumpet players is often coveted by guitarists. In a traditional sense, the sound of guitar in jazz is often driven by a want to be recognised as more serious, natural, and authentic within the jazz domain. The electric guitar carries with it many embedded associations, which could be viewed by traditionalists in a negative way. As Waxman states, the electric guitar is a privileged signifier of white male power and potency. He also suggests a dichotomy between what he calls black nature and white technology. By means of compromise and to seek authentication, many guitarists will then use distortion to create the illusion of a horn timbre. As is widely documented, Charlie Christian was lauded for playing his guitar like a horn. Just as a jazz player can be identified for their vocabulary and harmonic approach, their sound is also an important signifier of identity. For instance, John Scofield's crunch sound, coupled with his use of chorus, is a widely acknowledged feature of the Scofield sound. Chaining multiple effects together allows a player to create further distinction. In this instance, Scofield separates himself from other players like Mike Stern or Pat Metheny simply by his use of distortion. Alan Holdsworth's heavily compressed distortion honk sound is a culmination of his desire to sound like a saxophone, for example. As has already been mentioned, Kurt Rosenwinkel uses distortion to give a horn-like timbre to his instrument. Distortion became heavily associated with not only him, but the contemporary New York jazz guitar scene, as many of his contemporaries modelled a very similar sound, which in turn created a homogeneity within the community. As jazz guitar has become more popular, there is an ever-increasing need to distinguish yourself as a unique voice, as there is of course in all other performative arenas to a degree. Players with more modern ideologies and outlooks often attempt to move away from these fields, in part as a statement of rejection and also to demonstrate that jazz guitar can exist outside of the confines of the archtop dogma. Bill Frisell comes to mind here when considering his continual reinvention of soundscape and timbral choice, from bright surf guitar to aggressive distortion and everything in between. And perhaps like Miles Davis, remaining in the pantheon of jazz through the processes of reinvention, improvisation and redevelopment. Frisell occupies the jazz landscape more as an impartial explorer, delicately avoiding being bound to a single sound or domain. Certain microcosms of the jazz guitarscape have fairly rigid margins for what is permissible and what is not. Gypsy jazz, for instance, builds its image around its totemic figurehead Django Reinhardt. What is most intriguing here, however, is despite the sound traditionalists expect from this genre, Django's later career is largely ignored, despite himself using an electric guitar and amplification which had a coarse and distorted sound, far removed from the rounded tone of Charlie Christian and Eddie Lang, whom he modelled his earlier playing on. Ironically, gypsy jazz royalty Borelli Legren's attempt at moving away from the tradition to electric guitar was met with a severe critique not unlike that given to Bob Dylan during the infamous Newport Festival. Waxman discusses the dichotomy of white technology versus black nature. During the developments in 60s jazz culture, there was an enormous backlash from traditionalists who were opposed to the inclusion of electric guitars, basses and synthesizers in the music. It was felt that this eroded the identity of jazz in ways. There is of course another argument that the primitiveness of distortion and its connection to the unyielding noise, as Waxman puts it, is a way of becoming closer to what is natural, or as Torgovnik states, to overcome alienation from the body, restoring the body and hence the self to a relation of full and easy harmony with nature or the cosmos, as they have been variously conceived. Perhaps then the use of guitar distortion, albeit when considered outside its associative trappings and connections to rock music, is a way of returning jazz to a more primitive timbral focus, far more in tune with its African heritage than perhaps the structural trappings of the bebop scale, enclosures and extended harmony ever could be. While this point is flippant and said tongue-in-cheek, given that the purpose of the bebop movement was to elevate black music to a level of musicianship, complexity and seriousness that was normally reserved for white band leaders in the Western canon, it certainly gives perspective and tempers the traditionalist view that jazz in some way ended when the strict homogeneity of sound was broken in the 60s. Henry Jenkins' concept of convergence culture is referenced in Kevin Dawes' book. Daw quotes Jenkins with a statement that says that new media does not replace old media, but may force old media to engage with new media. While many scholars rebuke the idea of convergence culture given its overly broad nature, it is certainly possible to understand the use of distortion in these terms. Put simply, musicians in the 60s were growing up in an age where popular music was dominated by the sound of electric guitar, and by extension the new technologies, amplifications and emerging sound processing units. It is reasonable to think then, considering John Kovach's crossover listener theory, that the use of distortion is simply symptomatic of the melting pot of popular music influences that converged at the turn of the 1960s, coupled with an education system that was beginning to accept popular music and the broadening socio-cultural interactions of the racial and class systems in the 60s. Of course, the curation of sound does not necessarily have to reflect the now. Many guitar players, through education, adoration or otherwise, may seek to emulate a particular time through emulating timbre. I separate this here from associative authentication, although there are links. The difference is that tonal nostalgia is used to transport the listener to a particular time. This may be coupled with the adoption of a similarly emulated approach in terms of musical materials and structures employed, or even ignored to create a kind of anachronistic timbre. It would be remiss to not simply mention that equipment, stomp boxes, amplifiers, guitars, strings, picks and cables, for example, are of course a potential form of income and may enhance marketing streams for a jazz guitarist. And so it is entirely possible that a jazz guitarist may simply adopt a slew of sounds based on their relationship with equipment companies to a mutually beneficial end. Of course, aside from the above perspectives, to temper the many perspectives which may or may not resonate with certain musicians, it is also entirely possible that it is simply the ubiquity of distortion-based effects that find jazz guitarists experimenting more with it, something which was not possible in the first half of the 20th century.
So, to conclude, the electric guitar is perhaps the most important instrument precursor and catalyst for technological development in popular music. Through its many augmentations, both physical and digital, the electric guitar sits at the epicenter of technological instrument extension. The distinction between the connection between the fingers and the strings that occupy many purist discussions of guitar sound and tone, and the other, the amplifier, post-production, effects, the boundaries between these are all but dissolved. A guitarist can play a stomp box every bit as much as they can play the instrument itself. As Ladioha writes, it can be considered an augmented instrument, defined as a network of sound production and processing units, spatially extended and configurable by the player according to the desired sonic results. Its augmented and modular aspects, the electric guitar appears as an emblematic example of an instrument that is intimately connected to the present-day live electronic music praxis. So in short, while this presentation gives an overview of some of the key themes and questions surrounding distortion in jazz guitar, it is evident that we should not overlook distortion in jazz guitar as simply part of uptake of new technology, or worse, being of only interest to the rock canon. The term is no longer pejorative, and its function, purpose and use across the entire spectrum of jazz guitar warrants a more thorough investigation. The wider implications here are that of technology, timbre, and what is really at the heart of the improvisatory and interactive processes that drive jazz. Realigning, or at least extending, our understanding in this manner will further challenge the Western hierarchy, with pitch and structure sitting atop, so often used in discourse to describe these processes. The sound is every bit as important as the note choice, and a thorough understanding of jazz guitar's relationship with distortion may help us understand exactly how. Thank you very much.
Discussion of the importance of timbre is not new to popular musicology, however predominantly in the context of rock. While there have been some inroads in the jazz sphere, the corpus of research still reinforces Western pitch-class relationships. As Scotto writes, timbre only appears analytically relevant when it highlights, supports or reinforces pitch-class relationships. Scotto's assertion here is aimed at rock music discourse, however equally applicable to jazz guitar. The effects of timbre on consonance and dissonance is not without study either. Authors such as Terhart, Sethares, Tenney and McDermott explore the ways in which consonance is perceived and how it can be altered, and of course how this differs in various settings. Jan-Peter Herbst's text Distortion and Rock Guitar Harmony provides a really useful meta-study for those wishing to understand more here. Discourse surrounding the hard properties of distortion, its production, control, and the myriad subfields which occupy this space deserve a dedicated meta-study of their own. A balance has been struck here to enable the research to be suitably informed, but also not to create a quagmire in which the focus of this research, jazz guitar and distortion, is lost. Both Vertala and Jan-Peter Herbst provide excellent starting points at this juncture as exemplary meta-studies. There are many others who have discussed the perception and phenomenological aspects of distortion and sound more generally. However, here, Berger's excellent research deals specifically with this, and while outside the scope of this presentation is an excellent place to start. It would be remiss to discuss this subject without touching on research specific to the development and understanding of the guitar itself, While again there are no in-depth specific studies on the holistics of jazz guitar, it is here important to note the excellent work Waxman, Millard, Ingram have done in positioning the guitar's historical development. Perhaps more significantly, however, Kevin Dawes' new Guitarscape in Critical Theory has emerged as a seminal text which is redefining the way in which we view the guitar from a range of perspectives. My own research builds heavily on the work of Daw, using it as a model to discuss what I have come to call the contemporary jazz guitarscape. The field of organology here also holds vital information that we may use as part of the lens we view the jazz guitar through. Research such as Bates's Social Life of Musical Instruments, D'Souza's Music at Hand, Instruments, Bodies and Cognition, Ladioha's The Electric Guitar and Augmented Instrument, and of course Kartomi's on concepts and classifications of musical instruments are incredibly useful here. As Daw states, however, organologists have tended to focus largely upon the investigation of the material and acoustic properties of musical instruments, the description of portable methods of construction, tuning systems, timbre, the techniques required to produce the sounds from them, and an analysis of their repertoire. An organological approach must then be tempered with the emerging understanding of the augmentation of the guitar, that which is not the guitar itself, but is every bit as important to creating the sound of the instrument. The stomp boxes, the amplifiers, the microphones, the post-production, the picks, the occupation of space within a mix are all part of this construct. As De Vale states, even in the music disciplines we find that there is very little agreement on the meaning and scope of organology. Its true scope is perhaps neglected. It is important to note here that there are a number of excellent researchers who have in the past decade begun to unpick the fascinating relationship between guitar and distortion, albeit mainly in a rock music context. Jan-Peter Herbst, for instance, has published excellent research to that effect, considering the effect distortion has on perception of chords, aesthetics, history and production of guitar distortion, perceptions of heaviness, and a range of other interrelated subjects concerning distortion and rock metal guitar practices. While Herbst is a good example of what is at the forefront of distortion and guitar research, many other angles have been explored in research for over 2 decades.